Hello and welcome to episode 6, part 1 in this series exploring the many exciting features of Title Studio from Boris FX. This time I want to deal with the subject of keyframe animation. Many of you will be familiar with the concept of keyframe animation, utilizing it within your chosen NLE. My chosen NLE is Vegas Pro, and I've made a few tutorials on this subject relating specifically to Vegas Pro. I've also made tutorials on keyframe animation applicable to Title Pro from NewBlue FX. One thing is clear: although the concept of keyframe animation is fixed, the method of achieving it is not. Each application has a slightly different procedure for achieving the same result. Title Studio's approach is no different. What I mean is, forget some of what you've learned in relation to other applications. With Title Studio, we need to start afresh. I'm using Title Studio from within Continuum 2022. Your version's UI may be slightly different. As an aside, I should state that most of the issues, I don't like the word bugs, that I had discovered in version 2021.5 have been fixed in version 2022. If you've been watching this series, you'll know what those issues were. For the benefit of those who know little or nothing about keyframes, a brief explanation describing them and how they work is in order. Wikipedia defines a keyframe as a frame used to indicate the beginning or end of a change to a parameter. If we expand that definition and apply it to Title Studio, we can say that a keyframe is a particular frame of a title where certain parameters of that title are made to change their value. Two or more keyframes can be used to cause a particular parameter's value to change over time, resulting in animation. The variation in rate of change, known as interpolation, is represented by a number of modes that determine how the change varies over time. To start with, I want to describe the various elements of the UI that are involved in the mechanics of keyframing. By the way, I'll refer to keyframe animation as keyframing through this tutorial. I described some of these elements in episode 3, but for completeness I'll go through them all here. I'll start with the keyframe controls, which are located at the bottom left hand of the composite window. There are 4 of them, and from left to right they are: the toggle Animate static mode icon. I want to leave the function of this icon until a little later. Next is the previous keyframe icon. Clicking this will return the CTI to the previous keyframe on the currently selected track. Note that Boris FX documentation refers to the playhead as the CTI, current time indicator. If there are no previous keyframes, the CTI will return to the start of the currently selected track. Add a keyframe comes next, and its function is obvious. Clicking this will generate a keyframe at the CTI on the currently selected track. The final icon is labelled Next Keyframe and performs a similar function to the previous keyframe icon. Next, we'll take a look at how keyframes are represented on the timeline. A keyframe generated on a particular track will show that keyframe as a small white or red circle on that track. When a track is selected, the track color will be by default blue, That keyframe on the selected track will also appear as a white or red circle on the composite window timeline. When the CTI has been moved to a selected track keyframe by the use of the next keyframe or the previous keyframe buttons, that keyframe will turn red. The keyframe will remain red until the CTI is similarly moved to another keyframe, or the beginning or the end of the track. The keyframe can also be selected and consequently turned red by clicking on it with the mouse. In this section, we'll take a look at how you can determine whether a particular parameter is able to be keyframed. At the side of most parameters, you'll see an interpolation icon. This icon shows that that particular parameter can be keyframed. Clicking on it reveals several interpolation modes that can be used. The way a parameter changes over time is determined by this interpolation mode, which applies to the keyframe currently under the CTI. As you can see, there are 10 options in this list. A couple of these options will be known to those who are familiar with keyframing, but for completeness I'm going to describe the first 7 modes. Why only 7, I imagine you're thinking? Well, to be truthful, I haven't a clue what the 8th and 9th modes achieve, and I haven't been able to find anything in the documentation about them. The 10th, as far as I've been able to ascertain, simply performs a similar action to that of the first. So, let's go down the list of the ones that I do know about. None. Fairly obvious, this one. This is the default mode and means that no keyframe is active for this parameter at a particular CTI. If keyframing is active, selecting this mode will delete the keyframe under the CTI associated with this parameter on the selected track, and also restore the parameter to its default value. Constant. When you change a parameter value, this mode is automatically applied. If you then create a keyframe and leave it in this mode, no animation will take place. Hold. This mode ensures that the parameter value remains fixed until the next keyframe. Linear ensures that the rate of change between keyframes is constant. Accelerate does what it says. The rate of change increases between keyframes. Decelerate again does what it says. The rate of change decreases between keyframes. Ease in, out. This is a combination of accelerate and decelerate and is a very useful mode. The rate of change increases gradually, then decreases gradually until the next keyframe is reached. An important thing to note: be very careful if you have to change the interpolation mode of any keyframe on the selected track to constant. There's a danger that one or all of your keyframes will be deleted. Fortunately, a Ctrl-Z will recover them. The way the Animate static button works, like so many of Title Studio features, is quite tricky to get your brain around. It's even more complicated because functionality changes when one of the keyframes is selected. That's when its colour is red. However, I'm going to do my best to explain it to the best of my understanding. How keyframes can be generated for any particular parameter depends on whether that parameter's animation status has been enabled. As explained earlier, a parameter's animation status at a particular keyframe is enabled when its interpolation mode at that keyframe is anything but none or constant. Let's consider the two toggle animate/static states. It's important to note that this explanation excludes the last two interpolation modes. Static mode. That's when the icon is not red. If a parameter's interpolation mode is none or constant, adjusting the parameter value will not automatically create a keyframe. If the interpolation mode is none, it will change to constant. If a parameter's interpolation mode was other than none or constant at a previous keyframe, adjusting the parameter will automatically create a keyframe. A keyframe will not automatically be created if the previous keyframe is red. The new keyframe will adopt the same interpolation mode as the previous one. When any keyframe is red, further keyframes must be created manually and their interpolation mode must be changed. Animate mode. That's when the icon is red. If a parameter's interpolation mode is none, adjusting the parameter value will automatically create a keyframe and change the interpolation mode to linear. If the parameter's interpolation mode is constant, adjusting the parameter value will not automatically create the keyframe and the interpolation mode will remain at constant. If a keyframe is required, it must be manually entered using the Add Keyframe button, or changing the interpolation mode from constant to another valid mode will create a keyframe. If a keyframe is created manually, the interpolation mode must be changed for animation to take place. Note that creating a keyframe manually results in a red keyframe. As mentioned earlier, any red keyframe will prevent further automatic keyframe generation. To summarise on the use of the Animate/static toggle feature, because you can't rely on it in its Animate mode to always automatically create keyframes, my advice would be to leave this button in its static mode. Add all your keyframes manually, selecting an appropriate interpolation mode for each one as they're generated. Before making a start on a keyframing example, I want to say a few words about lower third structure and planning. Keyframing is especially useful for creating the intros and outros of lower thirds. A lower third usually consists of an intro, the lower third proper, and an outro. The simplest of these would be the fade in and fade out of the complete lower third. More complex examples would include the sliding or expanding of the text and backdrops. You can go a bit overboard with lower third design, so the advice is make it striking but not too complex. Most important is to ensure that in the time between the intro and outro it's possible to read the text, which is after all the main purpose of a lower third. To this end, it's a very good idea to involve the User Marks feature in Title Studio. This feature is very useful for planning the timing for your lower third. As mentioned previously, a lower third consists of an intro, the lower third proper, and an outro. To help make sure that the intro and outro doesn't overpower the lower third proper, you can place marks on the timeline at specific time intervals and build your lower third using those marks. Let's create a simple fade in, fade out lower third and use the User Marks feature to help in the planning. By the way, I'm in PAL land, so my frame rate is 25 frames per second. The timings will need adjusting for other frame rates. First, I'll open up the User Marks window by going to Window on the command strip and selecting Show User Marks Window. Don't forget that the window will open and be tabbed with the currently selected window. I'll quickly go through this window's UI. The bulk of the window consists of 3 or 4 columns. If the Frames column is showing, I suggest that you hide this by removing the check mark from the Show Frames checkbox at the bottom. The remaining 3 columns allow you to set marks on the timeline and to make comments describing their purpose. On the timeline, I have a short video of a brown bear. I'll allow about 10 frames each for any crossfades with adjacent clips. The video is 11 seconds, 11 frames long, so the remaining active length is 10 seconds, 16 frames. I want about 4 seconds for the lower third to be read, so that leaves 6 seconds, 16 frames for the intro and outro. As this will be a simple fade in, fade out, they won't need all that time. The fade in or out should be about 15 frames. So the 4 seconds plus twice 15 frames is 5 seconds, 5 frames. Which means if I want the lower third to occur in the middle of the video, it should start its fade in at the 3 seconds, 3 frame mark. So, in the User Marks window, I'll click the Add Mark button, which will generate a mark on the timeline at the current CTI. It will also generate an entry in the window. Next, I'll click in the timecode column on the entry, which will highlight it. I can then type in 0303. If you haven't come across this method of timecode entry, I'll explain. When entering a time in this way, you only need a leading 0 when the unit of the time value is less than 10. For example, to enter 24 frames, you would type 24. For 1 second 24 frames, you would type 0124. Back to the user marks window. I can now enter something in the comment column which describes what will happen at this mark. I know I want the fade to be 15 frames, so I'll add another mark at the 0318 timecode. The lower third proper will last 4 seconds, so I'll add another mark at the 0718 timecode. I'll then add another mark at the 0808 timecode for the end of the fade out. Now, you may notice that the timecode entries in the user marks window are not in chronological order. To reorder them, click on the timecode column entry. In this instance, I don't need to do that. I bet you're thinking that's a lot of trouble to go to for a simple fade in, fade out. Well, you'd be right, it is. However, if you're designing a fairly complex lower third, with multiple animated elements, a little bit of planning along with the use of the user marks window could save a lot of trial and error. Having said all that, let's get on with the lower third. The first thing to do is to change the text for the description. I'll now make the second line a little smaller. I need now to move the text string into a suitable lower third position. Now for the animation. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to turn the toggle Animate static mode into Animate mode. I'll leave it in static mode. With the CTI at the start of the timeline and the shape track entry selected, I can create a keyframe, go to the Controls window and set the opacity to 0. Because I want the opacity to stay at 0 until the first keyframe, I'll change the interpolation mode to hold. I'll then go to the first user mark by pressing Alt-L. At this point on the timeline, the opacity should still be 0. I need to manually create a keyframe here and change the interpolation mode to linear. Notice how the comment at this mark is displayed at the bottom of the composite display. I now move the CTI to the next mark by pressing Alt-L. I could also do this by going to the User Marks window and double-clicking the colour box for the relevant entry. At this mark, the opacity will be 100. Because I want the opacity to remain at 100 until the next keyframe, I'll change the interpolation mode to hold. With the CTI at the next mark, the opacity should still be 100. At the final mark, the opacity will be 0. Now, because I need the opacity to stay at 0 until the end of the timeline, I'll change the interpolation mode of this keyframe to hold. Okay, so that's everything done for this simple fade in, fade out lower third. Let's play it and see what it looks like. So there you have it. That's how keyframing works in Title Studio. As you may have noticed, it can be a little frustrating at times, but workflow does improve with practice. I've only covered the basics in this part, but in part 2 I'll demonstrate the creation of a slightly more complex lower third. In the future, I hope to produce some short tutorials that show the further potential of keyframing. As always, thanks for watching, and if you've already subscribed, thank you. Until the next time, bye for now.